I will do my best to keep it as lively as possible, but you have to work with me on this one, everybody, okay? It's good to see you. Hi, I'm Joel. I'm with Sisu. It's a Finnish word. It means grim determination. It's a fun company to work for. It was not about that. I'm going to talk about the story is the strategy. This is a quote from Dave McJanet. He is the head of product marketing at HashiCorp. You know HashiCorp? All right, anyway, well, I'm going to talk about the difference between what you've heard for the last day and a half and reality in a small company, because 0 to 1 and 1 to N is very different in product marketing. So I'm going to talk about the absolute difference between all these lovely frameworks and then what you actually have to do. And those things are super different. A little bit about me. I joined Janani and Abanov as being a former TME. Technical marketing is where it's at. How many former technical marketing people out there? Yeah, we rule, just in case you're wondering. I've been doing this for almost 3 decades now. I've known Abanov, we've known each other for what, 15 years now. I'm working with Justin's team at Snowflake. So I've been doing this for a while. My last company was Looker. We were bought by Google. Some of you might know that. The one before that was Pure Storage. We IPO'd coming out of there. And the first successful startup exit I had was TGV, which you all know, was the first public company bought by Cisco in '96. You all know that company, right? Yeah. It stood for 2 guys and a vax. No, yeah, it's funny for the tech people. 2 guys and a vax. It's not the French fast train. So just a quick show of hands. How many people here in tech? We did this yesterday, right? So a lot of us, right? How many are in a tech company with under 100 employees? Under 50? Under 20? All right, yeah. So I'm going to talk about little and starting very little. And I'm going to start hypothetically. Nope. That's going forward, but that's not. And I want to talk about what we're going to talk about. I'm going to talk about the story and the strategy. I'm going to talk about secular trends, which is the single most important thing you need to know about. I'm going to talk about the 3 key positions that are the first 3 things you need to build. This holds true for a small company and a large company, but it's really important when you're little. Talk about staff and what it looks like and the difference between staff in a small startup environment and staff in a big environment. And I'm really going to talk about how it doesn't matter how good you are at product marketing, which is probably going to get Rose to throw me out. I'm going to talk about minimum viability, what you need in order to achieve escape velocity, as we would call it in the startup space. And then I'll give you some tips around specific to general, which is some stuff we talked about. Always artifacts, make sure you're writing everything down. And then I'll talk about ITG as the last thing, and what I call the 101-201 problem. All right. Product companies. We're product marketing. Our job fundamentally at its core, to quote the folks at Google, is to know the product and the magic, they call it. Know the magic, know the market, and connect the two. That's what product marketing does fundamentally. And the big flaw in almost every tech startup is they love their tech. We love our tech. We're technologists. We love our tech. We talk about our tech. That's great. But we don't often talk about what's behind that tech. Our reason for existence as a company, why our company is valuable, what we exist to do and achieve. We don't talk enough about our messaging. So Ben Horowitz has this lovely quote. He sits on our board. He's one of our founders. He's a great guy who's done this many, many times. And so when he sees companies that are trying to cycle from small to large or trying to grow rapidly, he sees that over-focus on the product and the positioning around the product itself tends to be the pathology we see most of the time. But product marketing should not be an afterthought. All right, so we're all product marketers here. Let's look over here at the pink side. How many times is it about, hey, we've got a product, sales really wants to sell it, you should go market it. That tends to be what happens, right? So that's, of course, absolutely backwards. Doesn't work super well, because the question really is, who'd you build the product for? And if you don't know the context the product exists in, you don't know the market, you don't know the competitors, you don't know the technology trends, you don't know the environment in which your product exists, you will not be able to position and message and grow. If you don't know the customer, who they are, why they care, why they need technology, you'll not be able to grow. But if you do know those, you can make a product that really counts and really matters, and you can make a positioning statement about that product that really resonates. And this is vital in a tiny company. It's really important that you have a tight, crisp message. One of the challenges we have today in this current environment, and let's blame Google for it, because I think that's fun, is that digital signals accrue to the top 1 or 2 in a category. They accrue to the top 1 or 2 conversations in any conversational pool. If you're not 1 or 2, if you're not crisp, if you are not tight, if you're not at the top, you're on the second page and no one scrolls down. This is a truism. And it is a change in our business fundamentally over the last 10 years. Probably mostly over the last 5 years with the change in the Google search algorithm. If you are not at the top, you don't count. And so our message is super important. And in order to get to the top, you have to know that context and you have to know that customer. So what do we need to know? A startup is a bet. It is a gamble. We are in Vegas, so we should be comfortable with that right now. But every new venture, every new startup, every new product is an assumption that something will occur or that there is a trend that we are following. How many people have really worked at a disruptive company? I don't believe they exist, so I'm just made you do that to be a little bit funny. I don't think companies are at all disruptive. I think markets are disrupting, and companies tend to be lucky or pretty measured about how they get into them. But I don't think Netflix disrupted how we get our videos. I think Netflix saw a trend and capitalized on how we get our videos. I actually was part of a startup that was digitizing video before Netflix, and they crushed us like a bug. And but that's all right. I was actually also working in Cisco at the time on video digitization. And so anybody who was in that space saw that taking place. Netflix just happened to do a really good job. So our venture is a new bet on that trend. And that trend is something that Ben at A16Z and others call a secular trend. What is going on in the world that we can capitalize as a business? And we have to understand and engage with that trend. We have to really know what's going on in that environment in order to be useful to a startup. Because in a startup, we are a cost center. We are not driving revenue. We are not building product. We just cost money. So where do we add value? We have to know where this product fits and who's going to use it in order to be valuable and to keep our jobs. So understanding the secular trend is foundational in a startup environment, and that is the core thing, I'll talk about it later, that we need as we're building out our team. And it is a thing that most likely you don't have the time to train people on. It's something that you're gonna need to bring in relatively fully formed. There are 3 types of positioning. Let's start with the lower left-hand side of this thing here, product positioning. When you show up in a startup, odds are good they know it. It's the truthiness of your product, of your company. It's what you do, it's what you sell and how it works. And you have to absolutely understand that and be able to position it. The first 3 things you need to do when you land in a startup is figure out these 3 types of positioning. Everyone says, well, I need to build positioning. The answer is there's really 3 types. They're used for 3 different things. They have 3 different audiences. And in a startup where you usually have a product rather than products, like Abhinav, you're telling me how many products are in your purview, and I'm like, good Lord, that's a lot of products. I don't have time for that many. We have one, and I need to know what it does, and I need to be able to talk about what it does in a meaningful way. I need to be able to distill what it does down into something that's powerful and position that product. When I arrived at my current company, Sisu, coming out of Google, they actually kind of knew that already, and they should. It's a product company. They make the product, and they should know what it does. It's, by the way, the place where you don't lie, right? This is a place where you have to be absolutely consistent. I'm going to tell my sales versus marketing joke. Who knows the difference between sales and marketing? Sales knows when they're lying. Yeah, anyway. All right. Sales, by the way, tells it the other way around. The other thing that you really need to develop, and often this is the investment thesis of the company itself, is the corporate positioning. So also often you have at least a basis of this. When you're coming into a startup, you know that secular trend, how you plan to fit in it, how you plan to capitalize on it, where we are in the long term. This is a 5 to 10-year thought process. It can be very aspirational. Its audience is frequently your investor base. Sometimes it's the customer, but most frequently it's who you're hiring needs to know why you're there and why you're going to last, what the company is for, what you're trying to achieve. And again, it's aspirational, it can be very emotional. It also can be extremely vague, which isn't bad, but it does need to be high level, and it does need to last for years and years, your mission. Your mission is something that's going to guide product direction and strategy and what customers you go after. But again, oftentimes that already exists. So the hard part lies in between, right, as you can sort of tell here, and that is how you position for your audience. And this is what we do. This is the important thing that we bring into a startup environment as product marketers, is we combine sort of this idea of the reason that the product exists, or the company exists, and the reason, or the actual positioning of the product itself, and we say, why are we valuable to the audience that we're trying to talk to? And it seems really very basic to say that we are the people who need to drive that audience positioning, but audience positioning is going to absolutely be where your product team is going to hang future product enhancements, where your company is going to hang future investment from the corporate side. Because that strategy, which you develop when you talk about why people get value from the customer, is incredibly important. How many of you have read Stephen Blank's 4 Steps to the Epiphany? Hey, there's one. Fantastic. Do you know Steve?
I know of him.
Oh, okay. He's a classic sort of startup guy, which means again, kind of a powerful personality to hang out with, but a good guy. He has a really interesting approach to the customer and audience positioning, and I might talk about it a little bit later on, but we can talk about it as we go here. The same way you develop a product, you have to develop your customers when you're a startup. And you have to think about a customer development process the same way you think about a product development process. You're growing your customers, you're engaging them with the changes in the product, and you're doing that very piecemeal over time. Because your product isn't done, or you wouldn't be a startup. Your customers aren't fully bought in, or you'd be a big company. So you have to co-develop what's going on with the customer as you co-develop the product. And this is the value that we can bring into a company that is small and that is growing, is this understanding of where the product fits and why customers need you and its value. So let's talk about hiring, because your PMM skills don't matter. Let's start at the top here. The number one thing that I'm looking for in a startup when I'm hiring a PMM, particularly if you're hiring the first PMM or the second PMM, is market knowledge, without any question. I talk to recruiting firms, I talk to individuals, and I say, what have you done in the data and analytics space for my current company? And if they say, well, I worked in an adjacent space, I say, thank you, that's very nice. I'd love to call you in about a year when we're ready for you. And I have developed some questions around, so why do you think reverse ETL is exciting? And they go, well, I'm not sure what I know what the hell you're talking about. And I say, great, you're not my target audience, right? I'm not trying to hire you because I need you to understand the market and the context for my company. I don't have the time in a startup to have you learn. I have made this failure before. I have gone to a startup, and I've been working there, and I haven't been an expert in the market. And so I burned my first 2 years in failure because I didn't know enough to really be valuable to help the company as we go. In my current company, one of the first things I did is understand the product and where we fit in the market, and go to the CEO, and then we refactored our whole product team and our whole development team because we were just pointed in the wrong direction as a company. And so market knowledge is number one. The second thing that's really number one is the ability to distill simplicity from complexity. And I'll tell you this, the things on the left-hand side I think you can learn. The things on the right-hand side I think are pretty innate. They're very hard to teach. So if you are thinking, I want to start doing this, you should ask yourself very honestly if the things on the right are things you can do, and whether or not you want to learn the things on the left as we go. But we have to take a very complex environment, we have to take a complex product. We are not necessarily, I don't know what all you do, but we're not selling toothpaste, so we're not talking about sort of these intangible, cultural, emotional ways of selling. We're talking about a very nerdy technical audience. We need to be able to distill that down into those value positions, into those statements of value for the user and for the buyer. The second thing that I'm looking at, which is also important, but less important, because hopefully there are some people in your company, in your startup that already have it, and that is technical knowledge. I need someone who can learn technically. I need somebody, hopefully, who has some technical background, but I'm not necessarily looking for the genius in technology, because the engineering team will always be better than we are at that. That's fine. There's no surprise there, but we need to be credible in front of an engineering team in a startup. We cannot be marketing idiots, right? If engineering doesn't respect marketing, you end up looking like Google internally, and I'd love to have a drink with you at lunch. We could talk about how horrible that is if you got marketing in your title at an engineering company, right? But you have to really be able to stand your own. And I think you also have to be able to thrive in ambiguity, which means you're going to be picking up stuff on your own as you go, right? And that's super important. And then the things that are less important. I really want someone who's a framework thinker, who knows steps, who's seen it done right before. I really want someone who knows product marketing, who knows why product marketing is useful, but I don't care nearly as much. Like, I've brought in people who are former technical marketers, solutions engineers, systems engineers, sales engineering teams, people who've been out in the world, product managers. I brought in those people because they fundamentally get these top things around the market and the technology, and then we send them to places like this to try and learn the product marketing side. Because this is relatively quantifiable, and those things are really hard to get. This you can be dangerous in after 6 or 8 months, and those things take years to get to, honestly. I mean, imagine trying to explain all the idiosyncrasies behind Snowflake to somebody. It's way easier to say, here's what a messaging house looks like, let's start filling it out, right? The frameworks are easier to get to. So let's talk about viability, and let's start at the bottom here. When you show up at a company, I hope, depends, I hope you have minimally viable product. That's a really important thing to have. It's so you can point at it. Like I said, it's the truthiness. We do that. That's a thing. It does another thing, and that thing is probably pretty valuable. Minimal viable product is a concept. How many of you have heard that term, MVP, minimal viable product? Okay, great. So I won't go too far into that. But I think that there are 2 other concepts that are really important for us, and that is a minimally viable customer base. So for us to do our jobs, we need fuel. We cannot sit alone in a darkened room and come up with positioning. We need customers to bounce this off of. Now, the last day and a half, we've been talking about how do you sample customers, which is an exciting thing to do if you have more than one or any. But if you are a startup, your N is low. And if you're trying to get to a statistically significant sample, you need, 30, 32, depending on, how much statistics you studied. And you just don't have that as a startup. But what you do need is customers you can talk to. And so one of the first order challenges you have as a PMM in a small company is getting to know your customers. Their names, their emails, their partners' names, their favorite type of car. Really get to know them the way a customer success person might want to, the way an AE might want to get to know those customers. You're not selling them anything, but you really need their advice. And so building that minimally viable customer base for feedback is super important. Again, we talked about a lot of tools, and so there's one guiding thought for you about tools in general when we are buying them in a startup space. And that is, can you do it in a spreadsheet with only 10 rows because you don't have 1,000 rows? If you can't do it in a spreadsheet, paying somebody else to run the spreadsheet is a mistake, right? You simply have to be able to think of some of these disciplines on your own. And I'll talk a little bit later about the trap of the customer advisory board, but or trying to do large samples. Now, particularly in a B2B space, there's nobody to sample. So let's not worry so much about that. I was actually just talking with a vendor. They're like, well, we can get all of your customers to comment on how much they love you. And I'm like, both of them? That's interesting. Because I've asked already, right? No, I'm kidding. We have a ton of customers at Caesar, right? You saw the logos earlier, but right, like it's a funny challenge, right? There is an assumption inherent in a lot of those tools already that you are at scale. And so I just would say the rule of thumb here is to be cautious about that, build it yourself, learn how much you've got before you hand off, because those are a waste of time unless you can fuel them as well to get back what you need. And then the third concept here of minimal viability is of audience. And we talked a little bit about how do you build a developer relations platform? How do you build a community online that's providing you with feedback? Both of those are very much scaled questions that come after you have a product and some customers that are using it. How do you hit escape velocity? And I think that there's a minimally viable community number that, depending on your business, you have to hit before the community itself is self-generating and self-fueled and self-perpetuating. And when you're a startup, you are not there yet. So oftentimes what you're doing is you're looking for someone else's water cooler. I think we mentioned the DBT Slack channel as a place to sit and talk earlier this week. In my space, that's where people go. Our target audience goes to learn about data and analytics. So we're in that Slack, right? We're listening in there all the time and hearing the feedback that's going on in there, because it's open to anybody, which is great. Or use communities that have already been built from people like Snowflake, right? So we're using other communities to build that viable audience, or at least to get that feedback, because we don't have that minimal viability ourselves. And at one point when you hit a certain scale, you decide, all right, I'm gonna go after an audience of my very own, and then you get there. So again, hopefully you have a minimally viable product. Don't listen to anybody who's trying to tell you have a customer base bigger than you are and try and scale it until you're scaled. And think about when you are scaling what that audience looks like. All right, general rule of thumb. Don't do anything big. I think it might have been Janani again who was talking about it, but actually it was brought up here when we were doing the positioning and messaging. Somebody, I think you said it, right? And the idea here is if you're positioning for everybody, you're positioning for nobody, right? If you can't sell to one person, what makes you think you can sell to 5 people, which make you think you can sell to 50 or 500 or 5,000 or 500,000, right? So you have to go from specific to general. This is just a guideline or a piece of advice for you, always, whatever size company you are in, is build a thing. Go from specific to general, get one block, then a second block, then a third block before you build a castle. Having a vision of the castle is all right, that's what your mission statement is, but you have to get things done. And you get things done in increments as you go. So start with specifics. Start your messaging for one audience person. If you have a customer or you have an interested party, sit with them and tell them what you're building. Build that relationship, cultivate that customer, cultivate that one person, that 3 people, those 5 people. Don't cultivate 50. Don't spend your time too soon trying to think of how I'm going to deal with 500 of them. How will I learn what all my customers are doing? Have you learned what one of your customers is doing? Start there. Start with 1. That's it. If you got 1, go to 2. If you got 2, invite a third to come hang out with the other 2, and then all of a sudden you have a community. But don't start trying to figure out how you're going to build something that 50 people can come to. Just do 1. 1 is enough. Second rule of thumb, write everything down, always. A good rule of thumb, you're gonna get hit by a bus anyway, right? So, and then people are gonna need to know what you were up to, or somebody in your org is gonna get hit by a bus, so write it down. You will be resource constrained. This is a truth when you're small or large. If you write things down, somebody else can help you. If you don't have it written down, you're going to have to burn hours explaining what you need to them, or teaching them, or trying to get them to write it down. Just write it down. You will be resource constrained. Writing it down is a force multiplier. It costs time in the moment, and it allows you to extend as you go. We were talking a little bit about content development and how we develop content, which is very different for our target audience versus for our sales team. How we instantiate our messaging, and we explain it to our field or we show it to our customer. My recommendation for you is in a small company is you blur that line. So if there's one document you're going to write that you're trying to explain to the whole company what the new positioning is, make it a brief and make it available to your customers. Why not? It's your core positioning. Hopefully you're explaining it to your customers. Why do you need an internal and an external version? If is your internal version somehow different from your external version? I hope not. I hope your positioning is the same in both ways. Is there something weird and weaselly you want to do internally before you share it? Right? Just write one. And this is true for so much collateral you wouldn't think about. Sales enablement deck. Why is it different from the sales deck? Well, maybe there's some pricing and some stuff in there that might be a little bit different. But if you write a really solid deck for the customer, hopefully your sales team understands it. Why are you writing two? Write one. Write one asset. Think about blurring the lines between what's internal and external. It does two things. It saves you a ton of time, and it brings the customer closer. So you have that fuel, and you have that connection with the customer. It is also a force multiplier in that it lets you punch above your weight because you have more materials that go external than you would otherwise. Include thoughts in things you write down. Include speculation in what you write down. Have a place where you write it down. Use Notion or whatever it is as a way to share what's been written down, but make sure that it is written down even when you say, in the middle of the night, you're like, boy, this would be a thing that would be great to write as a blog. Some of the most success I've had as a PMM is around ideas for sessions or papers at conferences. Back when they had conferences, I guess we have them again now. But what we would do as a PMM team, and this is when I had a PMM team, or actually it was technical marketing team, where there's like 26 of us, all these smart people thinking all these cool thoughts about things they should talk about. Like, I don't need you to write a deck. I need you to write one paragraph about what you want to say. Put it down. We'll build a library. And the next time we have an event, we'll go to the library, we'll look, and we'll be like, that one and that one and that one and that one and that one. Hugely important. Pays off in a lot of ways you wouldn't expect. We gave it to our PR firm, and when they go out pitching to publications, they would say, hey, editor of whatever publication it is, you guys need to go to press in a week. You have everything you need, or would you like a couple of articles written for you in that week on, pull out a couple of those paragraphs. Here's things we could talk about if you were interested. And we got ourselves in a lot of places we wouldn't otherwise do. So write it down, including your thoughts. It doesn't have to be pretty. Just write it down, honestly. Have you ever heard Stephen King talk about his writing style? Very prolific author. We've probably all heard of him. He gives half of what he makes to his editor because all he does is literally, he calls it vomiting the story onto the page, and then she cleans it all up. But getting it down is the hard part. So write it down, doesn't have to be perfect. And that's what lets him write 2 books a year or whatever he was doing in his prime. He was really cranking them out. All right, so I'm going to get you out of here real soon here with the last thing, which is ITG. It's one of the core cultural pillars of Sisu as we grow. And it is all about just getting that first step down, right? You've gone off into the dungeon and you've battled a bunch of monsters and you've collected a lot of gold. It's time to go back to town, put that into the bank, buy some new armor, refuel your crew, and go back into the dungeon again, to use the nerdiest analogy of all time, right? So the idea of ITG is to try stuff, see how it's done, see how it works, write it down, learn from it, and just do it again. As long as you're writing it down and you continue to iterate, things will get better with time. So let's talk about moving quickly and not over-investing as well, because the iteration cycle is really important that it be fast. Last week, there was a great event in this very city, Snowflake Summit, and I had forgotten how quickly you can iterate on a positioning statement when you have to give it to someone every 30 seconds for 4 days. So in-person events are really useful for getting the pattern down and understanding what's going on with customers and doing that. So in-person versus remote has really impacted this. I had forgotten just how important it is to be in person with lots of potential customers when you're talking. So that's something to think about from a speed. A few seconds, because we really got to get out of here, right? We're supposed to be done in just a few minutes, is about the problem with the cab. The problem with the cab is absolutely a problem of over-investing in process around trying to get your customers all in one place. The other problems with the cab is that if sales owns it, all they want to do is spend their time selling. If product owns it, all they want to do is spend their time talking about product instead of talking about customer needs. The cab really does need, if it exists, to be owned by product marketing, but it doesn't have to be a cab. It can be calling someone you know in the customer once every couple of weeks. It can be going to dinner with a customer in person if you can do that. It needs to be something that has a minimal amount of friction in a startup environment. It can't be something heavy. Block off time for hypotheses is super important. You're going to come up with interesting ideas, and you're going to need to write them down, but you're going to need time to think about hypotheses. And in a startup, no one gives you any time at all to do anything that might be new or different. So just from a personal space environment, get yourself a little brain space, go for a walk around the park, and try and think about new things or different things that you might need to want or to do. And then last but not least, I'll leave you with the 101, 201 challenge of hypergrowth companies. We talked a little bit about it at the sales enablement channel. What do you enable sales on? Well, you have sort of the basics of the product. And then 2 months later, 3 months later, you need to enable sales again. Guess what you enable them on? The basics of the product. Why? Because in a hypergrowth environment, half of them are new anyway. And half of them didn't listen the first time. And you have this problem of having to constantly give them the 101 level class to your audience. So in sales enablement, you give them 101, 101, 101, 101, 101. And there is a huge and horrific pressure inside your company to teach them the next latest, the 201, the more special, the better. Look, we've evolved, it's so much greater. And you're like, look, they don't know the basics yet. So the same is true in a startup environment of your customer base. If you have under 2% brand recognition, why are you going with a more advanced message out into that universe? Nobody knows your message. You need that first level message all the time. And there's this huge pressure to say, we've evolved. I'm getting that right now. We've got some cool new features. I'd love to spend lunch talking with you about how awesome they are. They're really fantastic. But as we talked about in the sales enablement, do they change what we say about us? Do they change our positioning or messaging? Is it any fundamentally different when I'm cold calling somebody who's never heard of my company, which is everybody? How many of you had ever heard of me, Sisu, before the, right. So, yeah, well, sorry, Justin, probably Abanov because he looked at my LinkedIn. But nobody has. So does my new feature change how I say to you, you say, what do we do? And then I say, well, we do this. No, it really doesn't. But you're going to be under a lot of pressure to do that. So be wary of that in the startup environment and be able to explain why it's important when no one knows what your brand is, no one knows what your product does, to really double down on that instead of investing time in the more advanced side of the house as we go. All right, so with that, I think it's question time. If we've got the Slido, please have some questions. I'm interested to hear more takes on your recruitment strategy. Is industry experience more valuable than previous PMM experience? Yes, like 1,000 times more valuable, without any question at all. You know what it is, first and foremost, is it's the filter that you give your recruiting team. Typically, you'll have a recruiting team. You just say, look, I want them to work in a company that is on this list, or have worked in it, or be able to explain why it's important. It is important in tech to be technical when you are the first PMMs. I would say around PMM 4 or 5, you're going to want more muscle than nervous tissue in the team, and that is somebody who can run your launches. Almost a project or a program management skill, right? Rather than necessarily industry luminary, I know the market skill. But the reality is you can do without one and you can't do without the other. You can live without the PMM skills. And so we're talking about existential challenges here. Do I want to hire a great PMM who's got a ton of experience in my space and knows my market super well? Hell yes. If you can find one, please, dear God, give them my number, right? I would really love them. But they are few and far between. So how do you do it? You go with the top level ones and then you try and build in the features that they don't have, right? And be honest with them and develop them as people, as PMMs. Train them how to be better PMMs. But yeah, the PMM-ness is not my first level question, which is probably contrary to what the PMA would like me to say here. In a crowded market with similar messages from startups and established players in your market, wouldn't 200-level differentiation help? That is an excellent question. Thank you. Yes. It can help, but it's going to help much further down the funnel than the early stages of the sales process or the early stages of the lead process in marketing. We absolutely have to get their attention first, and that has more to do with how you present yourself in your category or in a new category than it has to do with the bits and bobs of the feature set. Now, if you're not in tech, I took a really excellent marketing class that was all full of tech people, and then 3 guys who worked at a dairy in Wisconsin who were trying to introduce new yogurt flavors, which is just amazing because every time we did some weird tech thing, they just called BS on it, and super valuable to have that kind of company diversity. But they knew yogurt inside and out, right? So it doesn't have to be tech. It's knowledge of that product and knowledge of the market it goes into that is the top level. So crowded market with similar messages. This is not an easy problem to solve, but you don't solve it by getting more granular most of the time. You don't solve it by saying, well, I have this feature and they don't have this feature. I mean, that helps. But what you really need to do is be talking about the value in a compelling way, not digging into why the product has more features or fewer features. And if you're not telling a differentiated value story and why that value makes difference in a changing market, which is the environment which your customer exists in, then your startup isn't going to last very long anyway, right? It's just not going to. And this is why we see a lot of startups fail when a larger company sees that there's promise there and they come in with the same message, but they're bigger and they have more market power. Absolutely they can. We see lots of less technologically advanced solutions win all the time in the market because they're tied to different products, they're tied to better messages, they're tied to more value. Technology does not win in this game. It is a necessary but not sufficient component of success in a tech startup. It is simply not sufficient as we go. Other questions, thoughts?
Any other ones?
Let me escape.
Okay. Let's give Joel a round of applause.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. All right. So